Hello, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and I'm joined today by two of my colleagues from the Institute of Race Relations, Mr. Terence Corrigan, the wise and venerable. Terence, how are you?
Well, hopefully I'll earn that moniker, wise and venerable, one day.
And the Lion of Benoni and the Man of the People, Marius Ruitt. Marius, how are you?
How's Nick? How's TC?
Yep.
You see, he's so down with the lingo that he even he just calls Terence TC. I mean, anyway, you can't buy that cool, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway,
Oh.
so let us get into the big story of today. It's a little bit of a quiet news day, but there is some big news, and that is, of course, the Matric results have been released by Basic Education Minister Angie Motshekga, and it looks like, well, they're better than she expected. She said that she was expecting a bloodbath. The class of 2020 has achieved a 76.2% pass rate, which is a 5.1% decline from last year. So quite a bit of a drop, but last year's was very high.
5.1 percentage points, Nick.
Yes, sorry, 5.1 percentage points. But what's interesting is that the Free State came out as the top performing province, followed by Gauteng and then the Western Cape in third. Motshekga said that while government must be applauded for its pro-poor policies, there was still a great divide between rich and poor schools in South Africa. She said that they need to close the gap between wealthy schools and schools that serve that are poor and serve African communities, and that's what her department is working on. She said she was very proud of the class for persevering against monumental challenges that no one was ever exposed to in the past. The bachelor pass rate, which is the minimum requirement to get into university courses, has gone up slightly, as well as the diploma pass rate. So this is, I mean, I think your mileage may vary on this, but the general consensus is that I think this could have been a lot worse, considering how long schools were closed for, how long they were disrupted for, that kind of thing last year. So my question to you, let's start with you, Terence. What do you make of the story? Do you think that this is good news, bad news, something in between?
Well, look, it was a hell of a year. So, in the sense that we have a 3/4 pass rate, that's a good news story. I think that the position that the Free State earned itself, it's surprising, but I do think that also, to some extent, contradicts what the minister is saying about how this is a case of resources. Certainly, my personal experience and what I've seen anecdotally, and what I just think is intuitively correct on this. If you happen to live in a well-resourced household, as opposed to, I suppose, attend a well-resourced school, the pandemic had a lesser effect than if you are one of those children who just didn't have the IT or the opportunity to sort of carry on. But there's a wealth of evidence from around the world that the standard of education that is produced depends on many things, of which resources are only one and not necessarily the most important one. School management, for instance. I think that typically comes out as point number one. Back in the 1990s, speaking on an institute platform, Professor Lawrence Schlemmer, the late Professor Schlemmer, said that the narrative that this is that educational disparities are all simply about resources is a beguiling one, and it would actually be quite nice if it was true, because then the solution is quite obvious. You just need to either redistribute or spend more. But there are plenty of under-resourced schools that produce very good results that speak strongly against it. And as I say, investigations from around the world tend to show something different. Until we clear up the toxic influence that teachers unions, that politicized teacher unions, often have. I think we're going to remain stuck in the starting gates, and I think that this cohort, as with all previous ones, are about to discover that when they move on into higher education, the standard of what they've been instructed in often isn't satisfactory to carry them forward without a great deal of trouble. So not as bad, certainly not as bad as it could have been. A relative good news story, but within a sort of swampland of competing problems.
Right. So let me very directly tackle a question that's certainly on my mind. So let me start off before I go to you, Morris, just talking about what this 76.2% pass rate actually means. So the students included in that are people who achieved 40% in 3 subjects, one of which is an official language at the home language level, and 30% in 3 subjects. So in other words, it's not it's not great marks.
It's not great. No.
So let me kind of be more direct now, Morris. When I saw that the Free State was the top, there's something in my gut that says seems a bit weird. And now one of the things that happens when they mark exam papers is they can adjust the marks slightly to make sure that if the test was especially hard or especially difficult, that it was generally that students don't get penalized too much between years. Morris, do you think our matric results are credible as a gauge of how good the education system is in the country, considering what it requires to pass and considering that there are, some adjustments and things like that? Do you think the Free State really is giving the best education in the country overall?
I just want to say that the fact that the Free State is number 1 shouldn't be surprising, because it's actually been number 1 at least the last 2 years, 2018 and 2019. And I think it also always does pretty well. So it's either been joking the results for a while, or it's doing something right, which, it's possible that, sometimes even in a place like the Free State, which was Ace Magashule has fiefdom for however long, they might have been doing something right with, what they did with education. And if memory serves, I think the Free State was one of the provincial education departments which was flagged as not being captured by SATU. If I'm open to correction, but I believe it was Free State, Gauteng, Northern Cape, and the Western Cape. So that could actually be telling you something. Perhaps it's because maybe people are still mainly pointed on merit there. Teachers are working hard. They're not protected by SATU from consequences of not doing their work or whatever the case is. So I think it's a hard question to answer unless you go really into the belly of the thing. So, it's only be speculation. So I think we might also be a little bit unfair to say the Free State doesn't deserve to be at the top. It could well be, and like I say, the trend has been the Free State to do pretty well. So, but I think the problem does come. You hear a lot of anecdotal evidence, and that people who leave matric aren't really, suited for both the world of work and for tertiary education. So I think that's one of our problems. But I think what we also need to point out is the overall throughput. In 2008, there were 1 million kids in grade 1. By the time they were matric, only about 200,000 of them passed well. I think it comes to about 20% of them passed well enough to go to university, and only 4,000 of them. So that's 0.4% or something. Got past maths with a mark above 80%. So it just shows you how many people, number one, get lost. There's a huge drop-off between going from grade 10 into grade 11, or also grade 9 into grade 10. A lot of people just leave school or start working, or probably a lot of them don't even go to work. And then also a lot of them don't pass, and then even a few of them pass well enough to go to university. So I think that's where the problem is. We shouldn't actually be focusing. I think that's one of the problems in when we talk about South African education. There's such a massive focus on the matric results, when actually the problems arise much earlier, I think, and that's where we have to focus. And I think also the question of resources is a good one. A lot of schools which don't have the resources of say old model C schools or private schools do very well. They get 100% pass rates, and high proportion of their kids pass well enough to go to university. I think it's a question of management at a school and how dedicated the teachers are, and so on. But also I did some research a couple of years ago now, and I looked at pass rates by race in various schools. So I looked at old model C schools, looked at schools in townships and so on. And what emerged was that black kids who went to township schools generally had pass rates around about 50 to 60%. If they went to Model C schools, their pass rates were pretty much the same as the white kids. There was obviously a little bit of a difference. That's probably the history. They're probably not coming from as well-resourced homes. Perhaps they're not going to not getting extra lessons. Some of the kids. So I think it is a question of resources, and it's a question of dedication of teachers, I think. And that's where I think the Angie Matric herself has flagged the issue of SATU and the toxic influence of, as Terence said, politicized teachers unions. So I think that's where we have to focus our efforts. And I think also, as I say, I think this focus on matric results is also sometimes a bit of a red herring. That it's not that it's not really an indication of the health of the education system, I don't think.
Right, and I think one of the reasons for that, very specifically, and you sort of mentioned this, is the poor quality of our maths and science education, which ranks generally in surveys as one of the worst in the world. And one of the ways the government has quite skillfully avoided this problem is by instituting this subject called maths literacy, which isn't proper maths. It's basically just very basic, practical mathematics, but not the kind of stuff that you can use for a sort of mathematics-based career. And that has allowed a lot of students to get through, because it's a relatively easy subject, at least especially compared to traditional maths. Also, with the pass rates, with you needing to only get 30% in one of your in some of your subjects, in theory, a person can get through school without having to do core maths. So they do maths literacy and get 40% in that, and then they can do one of biology or physical science and get only 30% in that. So not only is our standard generally not so good, you're able to pass, get the actual certificate. You could probably even get a bachelor's pass with pretty low marks in maths and science. So I think that our pass rate is definitely hiding that problem. And that is a very big problem, because so many of the jobs of the future depend on that kind of thing. If you want to develop your workforce, you need to make sure that you're up with numbers, or else you get stuck podcasting. Terence, final thoughts from you.
I think that something to bear in mind is that teaching in South Africa has traditionally been seen as a low-ish status or an accessible career. It's always said in full Model C schools that the wife's a teacher and the husband's a bank manager. So it's something you could afford to do. Amongst black people, I've heard this from multiple sources. This is one of the very few white collar professions that was available. So I think it drew in a lot of people who wanted something more than physical labor, but maybe were not prepared or were not temperamentally suited to it. I've worked as a teacher. Believe me, I have great respect for people who can do it. It's a tough and it's a frustrating job, and it takes a particular mindset. On the maths and science, once again from multiple sources, people in the science or engineering side of tertiary education. So there's a routine that's followed. You have your intake. 6 months later, you just brace yourself, because that queue starts to form outside your door of kids who are in tears because they had dreams and they're not prepared. And there's deans breathing down your neck. And it's often a case of finding someone who's a professor of physics having to sort of say, okay, these are the textbooks, you must read pages 1 to 15. Start almost trying to build it up. But talk about the jobs of the future. I think this is also about a capacity to innovate,
right?
And to do things that are applicable and practical in the modern world. Unfortunately, we've also fetishized this idea of a tertiary education. So you get a lot of people who will go into easier or more accessible courses, which often will teach them essentially 4 or 5 years of grievance studies, and then you discover that with a very mediocre BA, all of a sudden employers aren't really that interested in you. Right. It's a massive problem.
The podcasting. And we will get to the employment situation at the end of the show. But anyway, so of course this is a very important and interesting topic, and we will return to it soon on the show. But let us move overseas now to a piece of legislation that's got a lot of the world following it. And that is the government of Australia has been in the process of instituting new regulations which would require the social media company Facebook, as well as Google, to pay news outlets for news that's hosted on there. The argument from news outlets was, we're providing the content that draws people to these search engines and social media platforms, and therefore we should be compensated because we're essentially providing them content. Facebook initially was very reluctant to get on board with this, and so banned all news from its user base. So any Australian couldn't post news links. It was blocked by Facebook. They've now unblocked them after a meeting between the treasurer Joshua Frydenberg and the CEO of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, and they came to a deal that would make some minor adjustments to the law, especially the arbitration process about what is and what isn't news, and what has to be paid for. So this is seen as part of a larger global effort to increasingly regulate social media platforms. There's a push now in the US, there's a push now in the UK, and even in South Africa, there's a push to tighten up regulations around social media. So Marius, let me go to you. What do you make of what the Australian government is asking for here? What do you make of Facebook's response? And what do you think this says for the future of media?
Well, I trying to point out that nobody in the whole world could actually post Australian links to Facebook. I saw some people doing it on Facebook, trying to post links from whatever, The Age or the Australian, those newspapers in Australia. And even if you're in South Africa, you can do it. And I assume that was the same case for any country around the world. So all Australian media nothing could be posted on Facebook. I suppose if it had a .au address or whatever, that's how it was figured out. So I think this is going to become inevitable. I think these big tech companies, Facebook and Twitter and Google, a lot of them are more powerful than most governments now, I think. And I think it's probably inevitable that there's going to be some government's going to look at some way of regulating them. We've already seen, as you say, in South Africa, I believe the DA wants to make Facebook testify in Parliament about how they're going to combat misinformation and so on.
A specific MP from the DA proposed that. I think there was a lot of division in the party as to whether
that fairly well known one too. She likes boxing at the waterfront, I believe. But that also then brings up the question: well, who's going to decide what is misinformation? We've already seen in a lot of countries with dictatorships where Facebook gets blocked and so on, and other social media, Twitter or WhatsApp or whatever. I think I'm right in saying that in Burma, Facebook was blocked when Myanmar, when they had their coup now recently. But I know I think Uganda did the same thing. So who decides what's misinformation? Who decides what information should be shared with the public and so on? So I mean, Facebook and Twitter, and Google, they're very powerful entities at the moment, and I think it's something that the government's going to be governments around the world are going to be grappling with. And I do think if there were other, I've seen it said, and it's probably true, if there were other types of companies, they probably would have been busted because of antitrust legislation and so on. They would have been broken up and so on. So, maybe they're getting perhaps too big to be taken on, but I do think it's probably one of the biggest issues facing policymakers over the next couple of years, I think.
Terence, what's your take on this? Should the government be trying to regulate these social media companies?
Well, I think this is sort of uncharted territory. I think what Australia is doing is a kind of species of that antitrust impulse, even if it's in a sort of very, very roundabout way. The idea that big tech exercises an enormous amount of influence, but also gets away with murder because it profits from the work of other journalists by allowing the sharing and whatever. Those are not points without merit. But I think that the Australian government would have found itself in the crosshairs of a lot of angry people who all of a sudden discovered that their ability to impart news through a platform that they use every day has now been compromised. So I think that this isn't sort of an interesting first salvo of what I think is going to be a very long and drawn out campaign. The other thing, of course, is that media houses in general are struggling in the new environment. You can put up your paywalls and whatever, but there's an enormous amount of competition. One-man bands who will write little reviews of articles, and the stuff is coming thick and fast. So, do you really want to spend your money on a physical newspaper or even an online subscription? I have a couple of online subscriptions. I don't know if I really get the benefit that I could. So, Facebook mirrors a particular kind of a generation of communication and news access, and I think that Australia tried to challenge that, and I don't think it was a fight either of them were prepared for.
Also, I think we might have spoken about this on the show, but I think also there was a showdown between India and Twitter a couple of months ago, which was also, not even a couple of months ago, it was still this year. That was quite interesting, where Twitter, the Indian government told Twitter that they had to block certain accounts that was spreading information about it was riots that farmers were having around Delhi. And apparently some of the biggest riots and civil unrest that India's seen in the last couple of decades. And first, Twitter did block those accounts, and then they unblocked them because they decided, no, it's a free speech issue. But then also, Twitter also decides when it likes free speech, when it doesn't. I'm not the biggest fan of President Donald Trump, but or ex-President Donald Trump. But we all know what happened with him when other accounts, which are far worse than him, actually, in my opinion, are allowed to carry on saying whatever they want on Twitter. And as I say, the Indian example.
Yeah, I know the social media companies have sort of gotten themselves into a bit of a sticky situation that they have no real consistent standards and they're all sort of over the place, and whether they act or not is entirely dependent on the sort of mood in the office at the time, which is obviously not ideal when they are so influential on media space. But one of the things I'm very wary of is that we're going to get a sort of collusion between big government and big tech here, where big government is obviously being challenged by big tech, and in the end, they're going to reach a compromise which suits big government and big tech, but maybe doesn't suit the ordinary person so much. I think there's a lot of potential for abuse here. Although, as long as the internet remains a fairly open and free place, which it is, despite the attempts of many, even the Chinese government that is not always successful in its attempts to restrict the internet to its citizens. As long as that remains the case, it will be that people will be able to find a way to get news out. And I always return to the example of famous conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, who is completely deranged. He's done some pretty nasty things in the past, although interestingly, he actually tried to calm down the Capitol riot crowd, but that's a story for another day. But despite being banned off of basically every platform, Google, he got taken off the Play Store, he's off YouTube, he got banned off Facebook, everything. He's got his own web hosting site. His videos regularly appear on other social media platforms, not from his account, but being posted by people who are watching his content. So it's very difficult to shut someone down completely on the internet. VPNs are able to get around, sort of like the Great Firewall of China, which is the Chinese government's blocking of the internet. So I think as long as the internet structure remains as it is, even if there is quite a lot of collusion between big tech and big government, freedom of speech will not be harmed that much. But that's just my guess. It's very difficult to say how these things play out. Morris, any final thoughts before we move on to our last topic?
No, but I think, this is obviously, it's going to be a big issue going forward for a lot of governments. And the internet's it's changed. I think the implications of the internet and how it's changed the world are going to be up there with the invention of the printing press, whenever it was 500 to 600 years ago, and how that changed the world. Right. I think internet, I think it's a similar kind of thing, I think.
No, I agree completely with that. Anyway, let us move on to our last story. And this, of course, relates sort of to our first story. And that is that figures have come out for the fourth quarter of 2020 to show us what the employment situation was like at the end of 2020. And it's not so good. Official unemployment rate. So that is people who were searching for work in the past, I think it's 2 weeks or month possibly, is up to 32.5% of people searching for work in the last couple of weeks could not find it. The raw number of unemployed people is up to 7.2 million, which I believe is one of the highest numbers in the country's history. And the expanded definition of unemployment, which includes people who've completely given up for work, looking for work, not just people who are actively searching at the moment, that's up to 42.6%. So almost half of all people in South Africa looking for work are unable to find it, which is quite a shocking development, of course. Terence, your thoughts on this number? Is it going to get any better anytime soon?
No, I'm afraid not. We
could have just ended the podcast right there.
Look, I frequently say this, that I'm about to date myself, but I remember concerns about unemployment back in the 1980s, and this was bad, and it was super bad, and whatever. And I remember the ANC campaigning in 1994 that posted jobs. Interestingly, although we've subsequently discovered that this is the issue that the maintenance of constitutional democracy and social order depends on is expedited land reform. They didn't campaign on land reform at all in 1994. The PAC didn't got half a percentage of the vote, but let me stop there. No, and every state of the nation, every budget speech, employment, create jobs. You must create jobs. Well, we've run some numbers. I think our colleagues over at the Centre for Risk Analysis, that we've actually regressed over the past decade in terms of the number of jobs in the economy. It's no great secret what some of the blockages are. The labor bureaucracy, part of which is the cost of employing, but also the very considerable hassle factor. I mean, there's a vast amount about this. It's the lousy quality of educational throughput. It's the minuscule size of our entrepreneurship community, and the constant rapacious demands for rents in one way or another, whether it's BE or whether it's the construction mafia. Some of these things are demanded by law. Some of these things operate outside the law. But South Africa is a difficult place to do business in, and I think that the government has deluded itself, part through a lack of understanding, or part through just a blunt refusal to face up to this. That there are plenty of other options for people with capital to invest, and that includes domestic South African businessmen. This isn't all about foreign monopoly capital or whatever. I in a past life did quite a lot of work with small business, and I remember one entrepreneur saying to me, "Listen, there's no point in even looking at South Africa anymore. He's looking at Mozambique, he's looking at Botswana, he's looking at Tanzania." And this is a small labor-intensive firm. Will things get better? Until you're willing to walk through that looking glass and understand things like the influence of ideology. No, I don't think things will get better. And it is both an economic and a human tragedy, because think about what those numbers mean: millions and millions of people who will never have a chance to fulfill themselves.
Right, and South Africans, time and time again in our surveys, show that this is actually the issue they care most about, by far, and way more than corruption, crime, everything else.
And you don't even have to look at our surveys for this. I think there was Afrobarometer, which is pretty much accepted as they asked bluntly, would you accept a job kind of at a low wage or no job? And even if it's low wage Mac job, that's fine. It's it's better than what millions of people have at the moment.
Right.
But the idea that we can sort of have have an economy based on highly skilled Scandinavian style, no, it's not realistic.
Right. Morris, your final thoughts in 30 seconds.
Yeah, and just remember when Stats SA counts people as employed if they did any work for money or in kind in the previous 2 weeks. So if somebody washed somebody's car for plates of food, they were counted as employed. So, and yeah, I mean, nearly 2/3 of young people are unemployed. And I haven't had a chance to look at the provincial figures yet, but I'm pretty sure in places like the Eastern Cape, Limpopo, the rural areas of KwaZulu-Natal, I wouldn't be surprised the expanded unemployment rate is starting to get to 55, even 60%. And that's it's scary. And the government, the only thing must concentrate on now, every policy must be, how will this create jobs? That is the only thing they must concentrate on.
Right. And it is a problem that's coming at us, as Terence pointed out, from many different directions. So it needs to be solved now because it's going to take a long time to fix properly. Anyway, that is all we have time for today. Tomorrow we'll hopefully be having Frans Cronje on the show to talk about starting new political movements and all that kind of thing. Also, tomorrow is the budget speech, and on Thursday, Terence will return with Gabriel to give a little bit of analysis on what Tito Mboweni says in that quite important budget speech, considering the country's financial situation. Anyway, thank you very much for listening.
If our heart survives.
Yes. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for watching. Please share, like this podcast, this video, and we will see you tomorrow on the next episode of The Daily Friend Show. Have a good day, everyone.